You know, sometimes I wish that I had some kind of like opening sequence or credits or whatever to these videos, just A, to make them look slightly more professional, but also to doubly help with differentiating certain videos from the others. For instance, this one today is going to be of a slightly different nature to, again, what is usual. What makes it different? Well, first of all, wearing a blazer. Well, no, of course, that's not the actual reason. Today, we are going to be turning back to the kind of thing I did in a previous video, a medley of myths, to again talk about the mythology behind the Ragnarök Chronicles books, rather than directly discussing the lore of those books themselves. As was suggested in that previous video, medley of myths, whereas with that video I was kind of going over a few different small things here and there to kind of cover a broader number of bases in less detail, with this one, as the next one would be in slightly more detail on some more specific tales. Well, since this is the Ragnarök Chronicles, the main driving force behind this is Norse mythology, even though again I am trying to incorporate bits of mythology from all around the world. And in terms of Norse mythology, a lot of what we know about that comes from some specific surviving texts, one of which is called the Prose Edda, which I have a translated copy of here that I have now read. I've obviously gone through bits of it previously when doing research, but I've now fully read it in one go from cover to cover. And so now there's just a couple of sections from here that I want to do as kind of live extracts for you today. And with that, hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles, perhaps in the most accurate sense this time around, since although actually I guess we're not talking about Ragnarök itself, we're talking about more of those same source materials. My name is Dominic, and when it comes to discussing like the Prose Edda itself, or just what this is, it comes in a couple of sections, but the main section, the first one, is specifically from the point of view of a character called Gangleri. And actually, I'll also give a disclaimer at this point, like I did in the last Myths videos. I don't officially know how to pronounce these words, and even if I did, I may butcher them. So I'm going to say them how I think they're pronounced phonetically, or based on how other words that I know how they are pronounced. But if I get anything inaccurate, my apologies. But yes, it follows Gangleri as he goes to meet three wise men, three kings, three gods in essence. High, just as high, and third. And over the course of the majority of the Prose Edda, it's just him asking these three individuals questions about the nature of the universe, and they explain it back to him. In a number of cases, this is just literally saying, this is what this god is, this is what they control, this is how they affect things, this is how this thing came to be named. But in some other cases, they do actually then divulge into fully fledged stories, which are then where we get some specific myths from. Before we get into the actual stories that I'll be reading for you today, I actually also just want to point out that for an ancient text, this actually has some sections which are would be called sassy by today's standards, at least that's how I read them anyway. There's one point, like section 19, where it said, then Gangleri asked, why is there such a difference between the heat of summer and the cold of winter? To which High replies, or High answered, a wise man would not have asked, because everyone can answer this. But if you are a man of such little learning that you have not heard this before, then I would rather that you, in your ignorance, ask than continue to be unaware of what one ought to know. Now, obviously, the ethos of don't leave someone in ignorance, teach them what they don't really know, obviously that's great. But just the way that's worded, the way he replies, I don't know, I just find that tone funny to find in this sort of thing. Anyway. The stories I am specifically going to be going through today are to do with Thor. I presume he is the god that most people are probably going to be aware of, either before or after he became popularised in Marvel, specifically the MCU, but obviously existed in the comics before that as well, and then mythology before this. A couple of stories involving him, both involving the giants, who he's always infamously fighting with, but also got some Loki in there, and then we'll get on to Jormungandr, the world serpent, which we've talked about, and I'm pretty sure I talked about it in the... Yeah, I'm pretty sure I talked about that in the previous video, but if not, we'll come to him anyway. So, without any further ado, then Gangleri said, Skidbladnir is a fine ship, and a powerful magic must be called upon before something like it is crafted. Tell me, has Thor never been in a situation where he encountered so much strength and power that he was overwhelmed by might or magic superior to his own? High replied, I expect there are few others who could answer your question, even though many situations have seemed difficult to Thor. Although some things because of their power or their strength, had prevented Thor from being victorious, there is no need to tell about them. Not least because everybody ought to keep in mind that there are so many examples where Thor is the mightiest. Then Gangleri said, "It seemed to me that this time I have asked something that no one can answer." Just as High replied, "We have heard reports that seem unreliable to us. Yet here, close by, sits the man who can give a true account. You can trust what he says because he has never spoken falsely, and he will not start now." Then Gangleri responded, "I will stand here and listen for a solution. Otherwise, I call you beaten, because you are unable to answer my question." Third then spoke, "It is obvious that he wants to know these tales, even though we take no pleasure in telling them. You, however, must now keep quiet. It started when Thor the charioteer was travelling with his goats, accompanied by a god called Loki. Towards dusk they came to a house of a farmer and arranged lodgings for the night. In the evening, Thor took his goats and slaughtered them both. They were then flayed and carried to the pot. After they had been cooked, Thor and his companions sat down to their evening meal. Thor invited the farmer and his wife and children to join him. The farmer's son was named Thialfi, and his daughter was Voskva. Next, Thor spread out the goat skins away from the fire and said that the farmer and his household should throw the bones onto the skins. Thialfi, the farmer's son, took the thigh bone of one of the goats and, wedging in his knife, broke the bone to reach the marrow. Thor stayed the night, and just before dawn he got up and dressed. He reached for his hammer Mjolnir and, lifting it up, consecrated the goat skin. The goats stood up, but one of them was lame in the hind leg. Thor noticed this and suspected that the farmer or one of his household had mistreated the goat's bones. Then he realised that its thigh bone was broken, and there was no need to make a long story of it. Everybody can imagine how frightened the farmer became as he watched Thor's eyebrows sink down low over his eyes. The small part of Thor's eyes that was visible was a sight that alone could have killed. Thor's hands clenched the shaft of the hammer until his knuckles whitened. As might be expected, the farmer and all his household began to wail. Begging for mercy, they offered in return everything they owned. When Thor saw their fear, his anger passed. Calming down, he took from them their children, Thialfi and Roskva, as compensation. They became Thor's bond servants and followed him ever since. Thor left the goats behind and began the trip east into Giant Land, all the way to the sea. From there he continued out over the deep ocean. When he came to land he went ashore, and with him were Loki, Thialfi and Roskva. After they had travelled a little while, they came to a large forest. They continued walking that whole day until dark. Thialfi, who was faster than anybody else, carried Thor's food bag. They were low on supplies. When it became dark, they looked for a place to spend the night, and came across a very large hall. At one end was a door as wide as the hall itself, where they sought quarters for the evening. But in the middle of the night there was a powerful earthquake. The ground heaved under them and the house shook. Thor stood up and called to his companions. They searched and found a side room on the right, towards the middle of the hall, and they went in. Thor placed himself in the doorway, and the others, who were scared, stayed behind him further inside. Thor held the hammer by its handle, intending to defend himself. Then they heard a loud noise and a roaring din. At sunrise, Thor went outside and saw a man lying in the forest a short distance from him. The man snored heavily as he slept, and he was not little. Thor then thought he understood the noise he had heard during the night. He put on his belt of strength, and divine power began to swell in him. But just at that moment the man awoke and quickly stood up. It is said that for once Thor was too startled to strike with the hammer. Instead, he asked the man his name, and the other called himself Skrymir. "And I do not need," he said, "to ask your name. I know you are Thor of the Aesir, but have you dragged away my glove?" Skrymir then reached out and picked up his glove. Thor now saw that during the night he had mistaken this glove for a hall. As for the side room, that was the glove's thumb. Skrymir asked if Thor wanted to have his company on the journey, and Thor said yes. Then Skrymir took his food bag, untied it, and started to eat his breakfast. Thor and his companions did the same thing elsewhere. Skrymir next suggested that they pool their provisions, and Thor agreed. Skrymir tied together all of their provisions in one bag and threw it over his shoulder. He went ahead during the day, taking rather large strides. Later, towards evening, Skrymir found them a place for the night under a great oak tree. Skrymir then told Thor that he wanted to lie down to sleep, but you are to take the food bag and prepare yourself a meal. Next, Skrymir fell asleep, snoring loudly, and Thor took the food bag, intending to untie it. There is this to tell, which may seem unbelievable, but Thor could not untie a single knot, nor was he able to loosen any of the straps. None was any looser than when he started. When Thor realised that his efforts were being wasted, he became angry. Gripping the hammer Mjolnir with both hands, he strode with one foot out in front to where Skrymir lay and struck him on his head. But Skrymir awoke and asked whether a leaf from the tree had fallen in on his head, and whether they had eaten and were preparing to bed down. Thor replied that they were getting ready to sleep. They then moved to a place under another oak, and it can be truly said that it was not possible to sleep without fear. In the middle of the night, Thor could hear that Skrymir was sleeping soundly, the forest thundering with the sound of his snoring. Thor stood up and went over to him. Quickly he raised the hammer and with a hard blow struck Skrymir at the middle point of his skull. He felt the hammer sink deeply into the head. But at that instant Skrymir awoke and said, "Why now? Has some acorn fallen on my head? What's new with you, Thor?" Thor quickly moved back and said that he had just awakened, adding that it was the middle of the night and there was still time to sleep. Then Thor resolved that, if he could get close enough to strike a third blow, he would arrange matters so that this meeting would be their last one. Thor now lay awake watching Skrymir fall asleep. A little before dawn, hearing that Skrymir was sleeping, Thor stood up and, running towards Skrymir, raised his hammer and, with all his might, struck Skrymir upon the temple. The hammer sank up to its shaft, but then Skrymir sat up, brushed off the side of his head, and asked, "Are there some birds sitting in the tree above me? It seemed to me as I awoke that some leaves or twigs from the branches had fallen on my head. Are you awake, Thor? It is time to get up and get dressed. You don't have a long way to go to reach the stronghold, which is called Utgard. I have heard you whispering among yourselves that I am no small man, and you will see still larger men if you go to Utgard. Now I will give you some good advice. Do not act arrogantly. The retainers at Utgard Loki will not tolerate bragging from such small fry as you. Your other choice is to turn back, and in my opinion that would be the best thing for you to do. But if you intend to continue, then head for the east. My path now leads me northwards to those mountains that you can now see." Skrymir took the food bag and threw it onto his back. He turned sharply and headed north into the forest, leaving the others. In this parting, there is no report that the Aesir mentioned that they would look forward to meeting him again. Thor and his companions continued on their journey, travelling until midday. Then they saw a fortress standing on a plain, and it was so big that in order to see over it, they had to bend their necks all the way back. They approached the fortress, but the front gate was shut. Thor went up to the gate and tried to open it, but after struggling to open the stronghold, they finally had to squeeze between the bars. Entering in this way, they saw a large hall and approached it. The door was open, and inside they saw many people sitting on 2 benches. Most of them were rather large. They went before the king, Utgarda Loki, and greeted him, but he took his time in noticing them. Then he said, grinning through his teeth, "News travels slowly from distant parts, but am I wrong in thinking that this little fellow is Thor the charioteer? Surely there is more to you than meets the eye. Tell me, companions, in what skills do you think you are capable of competing? No one can stay here with us who does not have some skill or knowledge greater than other men." Then he who stood at the back of the group, the one called Loki, spoke. I have a skill in which I am ready to be tested. No one here in the hall will prove quicker than I at eating this food. Utgarda Loki answered, That would be an accomplishment if you are up to it, and feats such as that will be put to the test. Next he called out to the other end of the bench to one who was called Logi, and told him to come forwards onto the floor and pit himself against Loki. Then a trough filled with meat was brought in and set on the hall floor. Loki placed himself at one end and Logi at the other. Each began to eat as fast as he could, and they met in the middle of the trough. Loki had eaten all the meat from the bones, but Logi had eaten not only the meat, but also the bones, and even the trough. To everyone it seemed that Loki had lost the contest. Then Utgarda Loki asked in what the youngster could compete. Thialfi replied that he would run a race against whomever Utgarda Loki chose. Utgarda Loki called that a fine sport, but said Thialfi would have to be very quick if he indeed was to win. Utgarda Loki made it clear that the matter would quickly be put to the test. Next, Utgarda Loki stood up and went outside where there was a good running course over a flat plain. He called to a little fellow named Hugi to come to him and ordered him to run a race with Thialfi. They ran the first race, and Hugi was so far in the lead that he turned around at the end and faced his opponent. Then Utgarda Loki said, Thialfi, you will need to exert yourself more if you are to win the contest. Yet it is true that no one else has come here who seemed to me faster on his feet than you. Then they began to race for a second time. When Hugi came to the end of the course, he turned around, but Thialfi was behind him by the distance of a longbow shot. Utgarda Loki then said, I think Thialfi knows how to run a good race, but I have no faith that he will win. Now comes the test. Let them run a third race. When Hugi reached the end of the race and turned around, Thialfi had not even reached the midpoint of the course. Everyone then said that the contest was over. Utgarda Loki asked Thor what feat he wanted to show them, and so many tales were told about his exploits. Thor answered that he would most like to pit himself against someone in drinking. Utgarda Loki said that this contest could easily be arranged. He went into the hall and called to his cupbearer, telling him to bring the feasting horn, from which his retainers usually drank. The cupbearer quickly brought the horn and placed it in Thor's hands. Then Utgarda Loki said, It is thought that drinking from this horn is well done if it is emptied in one drink. Some drain it in two, but no one is such a small-time drinker that he cannot finish it in three. Thor eyed the horn, and it did not seem to be very large, although it was rather long. He was quite thirsty and began to drink, swallowing hugely and thinking it would not be necessary to bend himself over the horn more than once. When he had drunk as much as he could, he bent back from the horn and looked in to see how much drink remained. It seemed to him that the level in the horn was only slightly lower than it had been before. Utgarda Loki then said, Good drinking, although not all that much. I would not have believed it if I had been told that Thor of the Aesir would not have drunk more, but I know that you will drain it in a second drink. Thor gave no reply, but put the horn to his mouth and resolved to take a larger drink. He struggled with it as long as he could hold his breath, and noticed that he could not lift up the bottom of the horn as much as he would have liked. When he lowered the horn from his mouth and looked in, it seemed that the level had gone down even less than it had in the first try, although there was now enough space to see the top of the horn above the liquid to carry the drink without spilling it. Utgarda Loki asked, What now, Thor? Are you going to be so brave that you will take one sip more than is good for you? It seems to me that if you want to take a third drink from the horn, then it will have to be the biggest. But among us here, you will not be known as great a man as the Aesir call you, unless you give a better account of yourself in other contests than it seems to me you are doing in this one. Then Thor grew angry. Placing the horn in his mouth, he drank with all his might, continuing as long as he could. When he looked into the horn, he could see at least some difference. Then he gave the horn back and would drink no more. Utgarda Loki said, Clearly your strength is not as great as we thought, but you will still try your hand other contests? It is obvious that you are not going to succeed here. Thor replied, I will make a try at still another game. But when I was at home among the Aesir, I would have found it strange if such drinks were called little. What sort of contest will you offer me now? Utgarda-Loki replied, Here among us, little boys do something that is thought rather small matter. They lift my cat off the ground. But I would not have thought it possible to propose such a thing to Thor of the Aesir if I had not already seen your strength is much less than I thought. Now a grey cat, a rather large one, jumped out onto the floor of the hall. Thor approached it and, placing his hand under the middle of the belly, started to lift up the cat. But as much as Thor raised his hand, the cat arched its back. When Thor had reached as high as he could, one of the cat's paws was lifted off the ground. Beyond this effort, Thor could do no more. Then Utgarda-Loki said, This contest has gone as I expected it would. The cat is rather large, whereas Thor is short and small compared with the larger men among us here. Thor replied, Although you call me little, let someone come forward and wrestle me. Now I am angry. Utgarda-Loki looked over the benches and replied, Here inside, I do not see any man who would find it dignified to wrestle with you. Then he went on, But wait, first let us see. Call my nurse, the old woman Ellie, to come here and let Thor wrestle with her if he wants to. She has thrown to the ground men who seem to me to be no less strong than Thor. Next, an old woman walked into the hall. Utgarda-Loki said she should wrestle with Thor of the Aesir. The story is not long to tell. The match went this way. The more Thor threw his strength into the grappling, the more steadfastly she stood her ground. Then the old crone showed her skill. Thor lost his footing, and the contest grew fierce. It was not long before Thor fell to one knee. Then Utgarda-Loki intervened. He told them to stop the contest, saying there was no need for Thor to challenge others to wrestle in his hall. By then it was late at night. Utgarda-Loki showed Thor and his companions to places on the benches, where they were treated well for the rest of the night. In the morning, at first light, Thor and his companions stood up, dressed and prepared to leave. Utgarda-Loki then came in and had a table set for them. There was no lack of hospitality as to food or drink. When they finished eating, they turned to leave. Utgarda-Loki stayed with them, accompanying them as they left the fortress. At their parting, Utgarda-Loki asked Thor how he thought the trip had gone, and whether Thor had ever met a man more powerful. Thor replied that he could not deny that he had been seriously dishonoured in their encounter. Moreover, I know that you will say that I am a person of little account, and that galls me. Now that you are out of the fortress, I will tell you the truth. For, if I live and am the one to decide, you will never enter it again. On my word, I can assure you that you would never have been allowed to enter if I had known in advance that you had such power in you, because you nearly brought disaster upon us all. I have tricked you with magical shape-changings, as I did the first time when I found you in the forest. I am the one you met there. And when you try to untie the food bag, you are unable to find where to undo it, because I had fastened it with iron wire. When you next struck me 3 times with the hammer, the first was the least, yet it was so powerful that it would have killed me had it found its mark. But when you saw a flat-top mountain near my hall with 3 square-shaped valleys in it, one deeper than the others, these were the marks of your hammer. I had moved this flat-top mountain in front of your blows, but you did not see me doing it. It was the same when your companions contested with my retainers. And so it was in the first contest, undertaken by Loki. He was very hungry and he ate quickly, but the one called Logi was wildfire itself, and he burned the trough no less quickly than the meat. When Thialfi ran against the one called Hugi, that was my mind, and Thialfi could not be expected to compete with its speed. When you drank from the horn, you thought it was slow going, but on my word, that was a miracle I would not have believed could happen. The other end of the horn, which you could not see, was out in the ocean. When you come to the ocean, you will see how much your drinking lowered it. This is now known as the tides. Utgarda-Loki still had more to say. I thought it no less a feat when you lifted the cat. Truly all those who saw you raise one of the cat's paws off the ground grew fearful, because that cat was not what it seemed to be. It was the Midgard serpent, which encircles all lands, and from head to tail its length is just enough to round the earth. But you pulled him up so high that he almost reached the sky. It too was a real wonder that you remained on your feet for so long during the wrestling. You fell no more than onto one knee as you struggled with the crone Ellie, who was old age. And no one accomplishes that after reaching the point where old age beckons, because no one overcomes old age. As we part, I can truthfully say that it will be better for us if you never come again to meet me. Next time I will defend my stronghold with similar or other trickery, so that you will not get me into your power. When Thor heard this account, he gripped his hammer and raised it into the air, but when he was ready to strike, Utgarda Loki was nowhere to be seen. Then Thor returned to the fortress, intending to destroy it. There he saw a broad, beautiful plain, but no stronghold. Then, turning back, he journeyed until he came once again to Thrudvangar, which is his home. In truth, it can be said that from then on he was determined to find a way to confront the Midgard serpent, and later on that happened. Now I believe that no one else could have given you a truer account of this journey by Thor. Gangleri then said, Utgarda Loki is very powerful, and he uses many tricks and much magic. Nevertheless, it is evident that he is a force to be reckoned with, because his retainers have so much strength. But didn't Thor take vengeance in return? Hai answered, Even those who are not men of learning know that Thor made amends for the journey just recounted. He was not home for long before he prepared to set out again. He went so quickly that he took with him neither chariot, nor goats, nor companions. Leaving Midgard disguised as a young boy, he arrived one evening at the house of a giant, one named Hymir. Thor stayed there that night. At daybreak, Hymir got up, dressed and prepared to go fishing in the sea. Thor jumped up, quickly got himself ready, and asked Hymir to let him row out to sea with him. But Hymir said he could expect little help from the boy because he was so young and so small. And you will freeze if you stay as long and as far out as I am accustomed to doing. Thor told Hymir that he would not stop him from rowing far out from the land, and added that it was not clear who would be the first one to wanting to row back in. Thor grew enraged at the giant, and he almost let the hammer slam into him. Yet he let the matter pass, because he had set his mind on testing his strength elsewhere. He asked Hymir what sort of bait they should use, but Hymir told him that he should get his own. Thor then went looking until he saw a herd of oxen belonging to Hymir. He took the biggest ox, called Himinjot, ripped off its head, and took it with him down to the sea. Hymir had already launched the boat. Thor got in and sat down towards the stern. He took 2 oars and started rowing, and Hymir noticed that he was making some progress. Hymir rowed from forward in the bow, and the boat moved quickly. Hymir then said that they had come to the waters where he usually trawled for flatfish, but Thor said that he wanted to row much further, and they started another bout of fast rowing. Hymir then warned that they had come so far out that to go further was dangerous because of the Midgard serpent. But Thor replied that he wanted to keep on rowing, and so he did. Hymir was by then most unhappy. Finally Thor brought up his oars and set about preparing his line, which was very strong, with a hook that was neither weak nor less firm. Thor baited the hook with the ox head and cast it overboard, where it sank to the bottom. It can be said in truth that this time Thor tricked the Midgard serpent, no less than Utgarda Loki had tricked Thor into lifting the Midgard serpent with his arms. The Midgard serpent opened its mouth and swallowed the oxen head. The hook dug into the gums of its mouth, and when the serpent felt this, he snapped back so hard that both of Thor's fists slammed against the gunwale. Thor now became angry and, taking on his divine strength, he strained so hard that both his feet pushed through the bottom of the boat. Using the sea floor to brace himself, he began pulling the serpent up on board. It can be said that no one has seen a more terrifying sight than this. Thor narrowing his eyes at the serpent, while the serpent spits out poison and stares straight back from below. It is told that the giant Hymir changed colour. He grew pale and fearful for his life when he saw the serpent and also the sea rushing in and out of the boat. Just at that instant, as Thor grabbed his hammer and raised it into the air, the giant, fumbling with the bait knife, cut Thor's line where it lay across the edge of the boat, and the serpent sank back into the sea. But Thor threw his hammer after it, and people say that down on the bottom he struck the serpent's head off. But I think the opposite is true. The Midgard serpent still lives and lies in the surrounding sea. Using his fist, Thor punched Hymir behind the ear so that he fell head over heels overboard. With this, Thor waded back to land. Okay. Now, the story does continue going on after there, but those two accounts of him being tricked by Utgarda Loki and then him facing off with the Midgard serpent are two particularly notable, at least in my experience, Thor tales, which again I just wish to account for you there. You notice a lot of the language is rather repetitive, and that's often the case when you have stories that were originally in oral traditions. I mean, I'm more thinking about things like Greek tales from this, but I'm extrapolating, assuming that the same will be similar for this before it was ultimately written down by Snorri, who was the author of this. And because it helps the deliverer, the storyteller, to remember all the details if they keep on repeating the names, if they keep on saying similar things and reiterating what has just happened. But anyway, hopefully you found that interesting, getting to hear some of the actual original Norse myths from which we get some of our other stories from. Again, albeit translated from the original into English. Again, we'll be back to some normal-ish kind of videos where we'll be talking about other stuff to do with the Ragnarök Chronicles books, lore, my books themselves, in the next video. As I say, hopefully you'll check out other videos on this channel as well if you found this interesting, find others interesting, and either way, until next time I see you, just remember to keep on telling stories.